Hello friends, please like and subscribe to the channel and enjoy the stories. Chapter 1, The Unfamiliar Note. The sun sank low over the bustling cityscape, casting golden streaks across the glass and steel buildings. In the heart of it all, Ella Rivers navigated through the ebb and flow of humanity, her violin case slung over her shoulder. The city was alive with a rhythm of its own. Car horns blaring, buskers strumming on street corners. Here's a detailed and engaging first chapter for your love story with an unusual twist at the end. Chapter 1, The Unfamiliar Note. The sun sank low over the bustling cityscape, casting golden streaks across the glass and steel buildings. In the heart of it all, Ella Rivers navigated through the ebb and flow of humanity, her violin case slung over her shoulder. The city was alive with a rhythm of its own, car horns blaring, buskers strumming on street corners, and snippets of conversations weaving an audible tapestry. Yet Ella heard none of it. Her mind was consumed by the letter she had found that morning. It wasn't addressed to her, at least not explicitly. A crisp, cream-colored envelope had been tucked under her door, bearing only her apartment number in an elegant looping script. The contents were even more enigmatic. A single page with the words, "Meet me at the Atlas clock at sunset. I'll explain everything." No name, no signature. The Atlas clock stood in Central Square, its towering face a relic from another era. Ella had passed it 1,000 times on her way to gigs, but tonight it loomed in her imagination like a portal to some unknown destiny. Who could have sent the note, and why? The questions were maddening, and yet she found herself here, drawn by curiosity and a whisper of something she dared not name: hope. As the clock struck 6, its sonorous chimes resonated through the square. Ella scanned the crowd, her eyes flitting over strangers' faces. Then she saw him. A man stood beneath the clock, his posture casual, but his presence magnetic. His dark coat billowed slightly in the evening breeze, and his face, partly obscured by the shadow of his hat, was turned toward her. He lifted a hand in a tentative wave, and Ella's heart gave an unexpected lurch. Ella Rivers? His voice was warm, rich, and carried the faintest trace of an accent she couldn't place. "Yes," she replied, clutching the strap of her violin case. "Are you the one who left the note?" He nodded. "My name is Leo. I wasn't sure you'd come." Ella frowned, tilting her head. "Why wouldn't I? You went to the trouble of finding me." For a fleeting moment, a shadow passed over his face. "It's not that simple. I wasn't sure if you'd believe me." "Believe you about what?" Leo hesitated, as though weighing the gravity of his words. Then, with a sudden urgency, he said, "Can we walk? This isn't the place for explanations." Ella glanced at the bustling square, then back at Leo. There was something earnest in his eyes, something that disarmed her skepticism. Against her better judgment, she nodded. They walked in silence for a few blocks, the city's vibrant hum filling the spaces between them. Finally, Leo led her into a quiet park, its paths lit by soft lamplight. He stopped near a bench and turned to face her. "I'm not from here," he began. Ella raised an eyebrow. "You mean the city?" "No," he said, shaking his head. "I mean this time." Her laugh came unbidden, sharp and incredulous. "Excuse me?" "I know how it sounds," Leo said quickly, "but it's the truth. I'm from the future, 100 years from now, to be exact." Ella took a step back. "Okay, this was fun. You can stop now. I'm serious, Ella." His voice was steady, his gaze unwavering. "In my time, your music is legendary. Your compositions have inspired generations, but something happened. A piece of your work was lost, one that could have changed everything." "What are you talking about?" she asked, her tone sharp. "I'm a street performer, not some musical genius." "You don't see it yet," Leo said softly, "but you will, and I'm here to make sure you do. That letter you'll write, the one you'll seal with a melody, needs to survive." Ella's head spun. She wanted to dismiss him as a lunatic, but there was something in his voice, his eyes, that made her hesitate. "If you're from the future," she said, crossing her arms, "then prove it." Leo smiled faintly and reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small, sleek device, no larger than a pocket watch. When he pressed its surface, a shimmering three-dimensional projection appeared, a scene of a grand concert hall filled with an enraptured audience. At the center of it all was Ella, older, more confident, her bow dancing across the strings of her violin. Ella stared, her breath caught in her throat. It was impossible, yet there it was. Her face, her music, a world she didn't yet know. "Why me?" she whispered. "Because only you can save what's to come," Leo said. "But we don't have much time." Before Ella could respond, a sharp electric hum filled the air. Leo's expression darkened, and he grabbed her arm. "They found us. Who?" Ella demanded, but before she could get an answer, the world around them dissolved into a blur of light and sound. And just like that, she was no longer in Central Square. Chapter 2. Through the Rift. Ella stumbled as her surroundings solidified. One moment, she was standing in the lamplight of the park. The next, she was in a vast, metallic chamber that hummed faintly with energy. The air smelled of ozone and something sharp, almost antiseptic. The walls shimmered with what looked like liquid silver, shifting and flowing like a living thing. "Where?" she began, but her voice faltered as she turned to Leo. He was already at work, his hands flying over a floating console that projected holographic symbols into the air. His calm exterior had cracked. His jaw was tight, his movements urgent. "Leo, what's happening?" she demanded, her voice rising. He spared her a brief glance. "I didn't think they'd trace me this fast. We have to recalibrate and get back to your time before they—" A piercing alarm split the air. Red lights bathed the chamber, and a voice echoed around them in a language Ella couldn't understand. Leo cursed under his breath. "Who are they?" Ella shouted over the noise, her heart racing. Leo turned to her, his eyes filled with both fear and determination. "Timekeepers. They enforce the laws of temporal travel. They think I'm here to interfere, to change things. And maybe I am, but I couldn't let your legacy disappear without a fight." Before Ella could process his words, a section of the shimmering wall melted away to reveal figures stepping into the chamber. They were humanoid but unnervingly sleek, their movements fluid and almost mechanical. Their faces were blank, polished masks with no features except for glowing, slit-like eyes. One of them raised an arm, and a beam of light shot toward Leo. He dove to the side, narrowly avoiding it, and shouted, "Ella, run!" "Run where?" she yelled back, her voice trembling. Leo grabbed her hand, pulling her toward another part of the wall. He pressed his palm against the surface, and it rippled like water before parting to reveal a narrow passage. "This way." They sprinted down the corridor, the timekeepers in pursuit. The walls seemed alive, shifting and closing behind them as if the chamber itself were trying to protect them, or trap them. Ella's breath came in ragged gasps, her violin case bouncing against her back. "Why are they after me?" she managed to ask between gulps of air. "They're not," Leo said grimly. "They're after me, but you're a complication." "Thanks for clearing that up," she shot back, her sarcasm masking her terror. They reached another chamber, this one dominated by a massive, circular portal that pulsed with light. Symbols floated around its edges, shifting and rearranging in intricate patterns. Leo released her hand and ran to another console. "I can send you back," he said, his fingers flying over the controls. "But it has to be now." "What about you?" Ella asked, her voice trembling. Leo hesitated. "I'll follow as soon as I can." "But if they catch me—" He didn't finish the sentence. The portal flared, its light growing brighter. The room vibrated with energy. "Go!" Leo shouted. Ella hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to stay, to demand answers. But the urgency in Leo's voice and the growing sound of footsteps from the corridor pushed her forward. She stepped toward the portal just as the timekeepers burst into the chamber. One of them raised an arm, and a beam of light shot toward her. "Ella!" Leo shouted. The beam hit the portal's edge as Ella stepped through, and for a moment, everything dissolved into chaos. Light, sound, and motion blurred into an incomprehensible whirlwind. When Ella's vision cleared, she was standing in a familiar place, the park near Central Square. The air was cool, the lamplight soft, but something was off. The park was eerily silent, and the city's usual hum was absent. Her violin case felt heavier than before. Frowning, she opened it. Inside, instead of her instrument, she found a sleek, unfamiliar device, the same one Leo had shown her earlier. It was still active, its surface glowing faintly. A message appeared on the screen. "Ella, if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it back with you. The timekeepers will come looking for you. Hide the device, protect your music, and trust no one. Leo." Ella's hands trembled as she closed the case. She looked around, her mind racing. The clock in the square struck midnight, its chime echoing in the empty air. And then she saw it. A figure in the distance, moving toward her. It wasn't Leo. The hunt had already begun. Chapter 3. The Hunter and the Fugitive. Ella's breath caught as the figure in the distance drew closer. The glow of the streetlights illuminated its form, a timekeeper, its sleek metallic body reflecting the faint light like liquid mercury. Its featureless face turned in her direction, its glowing eyes locking onto her. Her first instinct was to run, but where? The streets were unnervingly empty, the city's familiar bustle replaced by a disquieting stillness. Gripping the violin case tightly, she forced herself to think. Leo had said to hide the device, protect the music, trust no one. The timekeeper moved with fluid precision, closing the distance faster than she anticipated. She spun on her heel and sprinted toward a narrow alley between two buildings. The sound of its pursuit echoed behind her, a rhythmic thrum of energy that sent chills down her spine. She burst into the alley, her heart pounding as she scanned for an escape route. Her eyes landed on a rusted fire escape, its ladder just out of reach. Gritting her teeth, she jumped, her fingers barely gripping the bottom rung. She hauled herself up, adrenaline lending her strength, and climbed as fast as she could. Below, the timekeeper stopped at the base of the ladder. It tilted its head as if analyzing her movements before raising an arm. A beam of light shot out, striking the ladder just below her feet. The metal groaned and twisted, but Ella kept climbing, desperation driving her onward. She reached the rooftop and staggered to her feet, the city stretching out before her in a maze of shadow and light. The timekeeper wasn't far behind. She could hear the hum of its energy as it ascended the crumbling fire escape. There was no time to think. She spotted another building nearby, its rooftop separated by a narrow alley. Without hesitation, she ran and leaped, the violin case thudding against her back as she landed unsteadily on the other side. But the timekeeper wasn't deterred. It leaped after her with an effortless grace, its movements eerily silent. Ella's chest tightened as she realized she couldn't outrun it forever. She darted across the rooftop, her mind racing. The device, what had Leo called it? A relic? A key? If it was her only chance, she needed to figure out how to use it. Skidding to a stop, she opened the violin case and grabbed the sleek, glowing device. Its surface was warm, almost alive, and it seemed to pulse in time with her racing heartbeat. "What do you do?" she whispered frantically. The device reacted to her voice, its surface shifting to display a holographic interface. Symbols she didn't recognize floated in the air, rearranging themselves into patterns that seemed both alien and strangely familiar. The timekeeper reached the rooftop, its blank face focused on her. It raised its arm, the beam of light charging again. Ella's fingers brushed over the device, instinct guiding her as much as panic. She pressed a symbol that glowed brighter than the others, and the device emitted a sharp, resonant tone. The air around her seemed to ripple, the rooftop trembling beneath her feet. The timekeeper hesitated, its glowing eyes narrowing as if it recognized the device's power. The ripple expanded, forming a shimmering barrier between her and the timekeeper. It stepped forward, but the barrier pushed back, forcing it to retreat. Ella stared in shock as the timekeeper's movements grew sluggish, its metallic body flickering like a faulty hologram. The device in her hands pulsed again, and the timekeeper vanished in a burst of light, leaving only a faint scorch mark on the rooftop. For a moment, Ella stood frozen, the device still humming softly in her hands. The city's eerie silence enveloped her once more, but she knew it was far from over. She sank to her knees, her breath ragged, and stared at the device. "What are you?" she whispered. The holographic interface shifted again, and this time, a new message appeared. "Location compromised. Further instructions pending. Activate the next sequence to secure passage." Ella's pulse quickened. Secure passage? To where? Before she could process the message, a low, mechanical hum echoed from the alley below. She peered over the edge and saw two more timekeepers, their glowing eyes scanning the area. Her grip tightened on the device. Whatever this thing was, it had saved her once. But could it do so again? And at what cost? A single thought burned in her mind as she rose to her feet. She couldn't trust anyone, but she also couldn't do this alone. Leo had promised to explain everything. If there was even the slightest chance he was still out there, she had to find him. Somehow, Ella knew that her music, the legacy Leo had spoken of, was the key to all of this. But what she didn't know was why her melodies held such power, and why the future depended on them. The chase wasn't over. It was just beginning. Chapter 4. The Melodies of the Unknown. Ella clutched the device against her chest, its warmth pulsating in a rhythm that seemed to echo her own heartbeat. Below, the two timekeepers moved with the same unsettling precision, their glowing eyes scanning the alley. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but the city felt foreign now, its familiar streets and rooftops twisted into a labyrinth of uncertainty. The message on the device still glowed faintly. Activate the next sequence to secure passage. She didn't understand what it meant, but staying in one place was no longer an option. She glanced across the rooftops and spotted a faint shimmer in the air about 50 feet away, a distortion, like heat rising from pavement. It looked out of place, almost intentional. Ella ran. The timekeepers below reacted instantly, their blank faces tilting upward as they locked onto her movement. One of them leaped onto the fire escape, its metallic limbs bending unnaturally as it ascended with alarming speed. The shimmer was closer now, and as she approached, she could hear a faint, melodic hum resonating from it, a sound that tugged at her memory, familiar yet elusive. She didn't stop to think. With the device clutched in one hand and her violin case slung over her shoulder, she leaped toward the distortion. The air around her rippled as she passed through, and the world shifted. Suddenly, Ella was no longer on the rooftop. The space she found herself in was vast and cavernous, illuminated by strands of light that spiraled like threads in a loom. The floor beneath her was smooth and reflective, a surface that seemed to stretch into infinity. The air was warm, tinged with the faint scent of something sweet and earthy, like blooming flowers after a rainstorm. Ella turned in a slow circle, her breath caught in her throat. The threads of light moved in patterns that felt purposeful, weaving intricate shapes that dissolved as quickly as they formed. "What is this place?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the melodic hum that filled the air. As if in response, the device in her hand activated again. A projection appeared above it, displaying a three-dimensional map that pulsed faintly with light. At the center was a symbol she recognized, a treble clef, glowing softly. She reached out to touch the projection, and the map shifted, zooming in on a location marked with a small blinking dot. Beneath it, text appeared, Sanctuary Point. Follow the melody. Ella's pulse quickened. Follow the melody? She tightened her grip on the device and glanced around, searching for any sign of direction. Then she heard it. A faint, lilting tune floated through the space, carried on the air like a whisper. It was delicate, almost hesitant, but unmistakable. It was her music, the opening notes of a piece she'd composed years ago, one she'd never shared with anyone. Her fingers trembled as she unslung her violin case. The moment she opened it, the strings of her instrument vibrated softly, as if resonating with the unseen melody. Taking a deep breath, Ella lifted the violin to her shoulder and drew the bow across the strings. The sound that emerged wasn't just music, it was power, raw and vibrant, weaving through the air and merging with the threads of light around her. The space responded instantly. The threads began to shift and dance, forming a pathway that stretched into the distance. The melody grew stronger, guiding her steps. But the harmony didn't last. A sharp, discordant note sliced through the air, jarring and cold. The threads of light trembled, and a dark shadow rippled at the edges of the space. Ella turned, her heart pounding, and saw them, the timekeepers. They had followed her. "Impossible," she murmured, her voice shaking. She tightened her grip on the violin and continued to play, the melody becoming faster, more urgent. The pathway ahead grew brighter, but so did the shadow behind her. The timekeepers stepped forward, their movements deliberate. One of them raised an arm, and a beam of light shot toward her. Ella barely dodged, the heat of the blast searing the air beside her. She stumbled, but kept playing, her music frantic and dissonant now, mirroring her panic. The threads of light around her flickered, as if struggling to hold their form. The device in her hand pulsed, and a new message appeared. "Threshold nearing. Play the key sequence to unlock." "The key sequence?" she shouted. What does that even mean? The answer came not from the device, but from within her. The melody shifted in her mind, fragments of forgotten compositions merging into something new. She closed her eyes, letting her instincts take over, and her fingers danced across the strings. The threads of light responded, growing brighter and more vibrant. The pathway ahead solidified, and a doorway began to form at its end, a swirling vortex of light and shadow. The timekeepers hesitated, their forms flickering as if the energy of the space was rejecting them. Ella ran toward the doorway, her violin still singing. The melody rose to a crescendo, the vibrations coursing through her like a lifeline. As she reached the vortex, the timekeepers made one last attempt to stop her. A beam of light grazed her arm, searing her sleeve and sending a sharp pain through her shoulder. She stumbled but didn't stop. With a final burst of strength, she leaped into the vortex, her music ringing out in a triumphant, defiant note. The world dissolved into light and sound, and Ella was gone. When she opened her eyes, she was standing in a forest. The air was cool and filled with the scent of pine. In the distance, a small cabin stood, smoke curling from its chimney. The device in her hand vibrated, displaying a single word, sanctuary. But as Ella approached the cabin, her relief turned to unease. The door was ajar, and the faint strains of a violin echoed from within. She wasn't alone. Chapter 5. Shadows in the Sanctuary. Ella hesitated at the edge of the clearing, her pulse racing as the haunting melody from the cabin drifted toward her. It was eerily familiar, not just the notes, but the way they were played. The subtle hesitations, the aching vibrato. It was her style, unmistakable and deeply personal. But how? She gripped the device tightly, its glow dimming as if conserving its energy. Her violin hung at her side, its strings silent for the first time since her escape. The forest around her seemed to hold its breath, the stillness broken only by the sound of her footsteps as she crossed the threshold. The cabin's door creaked open wider, revealing a dimly lit interior. The walls were lined with shelves, each one crowded with strange objects, glass orbs that shimmered faintly, mechanical parts that hummed softly, and stacks of ancient-looking manuscripts. At the center of the room was a small table, and beside it stood a figure. Ella froze. The figure was tall and cloaked, its back turned to her. Its hands moved gracefully, drawing the bow across a violin that gleamed like polished obsidian. The music was hypnotic, its beauty laced with an undercurrent of sorrow. "Who are you?" Ella asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The figure stopped playing but didn't turn. Instead, it lowered the violin and spoke, its voice low and resonant. "You've come farther than I expected, Ella, but you're not ready yet." The words sent a chill through her. The familiarity of her name on a stranger's lips felt intrusive, invasive. "How do you know my name?" she demanded, stepping forward. "And why were you playing my music?" The figure turned slowly, and Ella's breath caught. It wasn't a person, not entirely. Its face was obscured by a mask, sleek and metallic like the timekeepers, but its eyes were startlingly human, a piercing blue that burned with an intensity she couldn't place. "I've known you longer than you can imagine," it said, setting the violin down on the table. "And your music, it's more than notes. It's the code of something ancient, something powerful. You've only just begun to understand it." Ella shook her head, her grip tightening on the device. "No more riddles. I want answers. Who are you, and why are the timekeepers after me?" The figure stepped closer, and Ella resisted the urge to step back. It reached for the violin case slung over her shoulder, but stopped just short, as if asking for permission. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded. The figure gently took her violin and examined it, its fingers brushing over the wood with reverence. "This instrument is more than it appears. It's a conduit, a way to channel the frequencies of the universe. The timekeepers, they fear what you represent, what your music can unlock." "Unlock what?" Ella asked, her voice trembling. "The rift," the figure said simply. "A passage to worlds untouched by time, realities where the rules are different. The timekeepers exist to protect the balance, but sometimes that balance is built on lies." Ella felt the weight of the words settle over her like a shroud. "And Leo? What happened to him?" The figure's expression darkened. "Leo tried to defy them, just as you're doing now. Thought he wanted to protect you. But the rift, it's unpredictable. If he's alive, he's somewhere between." "Between what?" "Between time. Between worlds, lost." Ella's chest tightened. The idea of Leo, trapped and alone in some in-between space, filled her with a sharp ache. Then I have to find him. The figure placed her violin back in her hands. If you choose that path, there's no turning back. The rift will test you, bend you. You'll need more than music, you'll need resolve. I don't care, Ella said, her voice firm. If there's a chance he's still out there, I'll take it. The figure studied her for a long moment before nodding. It reached for one of the shelves and retrieved a small crystalline object. It was shaped like a key, its surface shimmering with iridescent light. This will open the next doorway, it said, handing it to her. But beware. Each step closer to the rift draws their attention. The timekeepers won't stop until they've silenced your song. Ella took the key, its cool surface sending a shiver through her palm. Let them try, she said, her determination burning brighter than her fear. The figure stepped back, its form dissolving into shadow. Play, Ella. The path will reveal itself. And then it was gone. Ella stepped out of the cabin into the dark forest, the crystalline key in one hand and her violin in the other. The stillness pressed against her, but she refused to let it unnerve her. She raised her violin to her shoulder and began to play. The melody that emerged was unlike anything she'd ever composed. It was raw, primal, and impossibly ancient, as though the instrument itself was guiding her. The threads of light appeared again, weaving a pathway through the trees. In the distance, the hum of the timekeepers grew louder. Ella didn't stop. She followed the melody, the key glowing brighter with each note. The forest thinned, and ahead, the air shimmered with the same distortion she'd seen before. This time, it pulsed in rhythm with her music, beckoning her forward. As she stepped closer, the distortion solidified into an enormous gateway, its surface swirling with colors and shapes that defied comprehension. The rift. Ella's heart pounded as she lifted the crystalline key and fit it into the gateway. The moment it clicked into place, the rift roared to life, its energy crackling and surging around her. Behind her, the timekeepers emerged from the shadows, their glowing eyes fixed on her. Ella didn't hesitate. With one final defiant note, she stepped into the rift. Final chapter, the song beyond time. Ella's world shattered into light and sound as she stepped into the rift. The sensation was overwhelming, like being pulled in every direction at once. Her body stretched thin across infinite realities. Yet at the center of the chaos, she could feel the melody. It was there, deep and steady, guiding her like a thread through the storm. Her feet found solid ground, though the landscape around her was anything but stable. The air shimmered, filled with fragments of other worlds. An endless ocean suspended in the sky, towering mountains floating like clouds, and cities made of light and shadow. It was beautiful and terrifying. The device in her hand flared to life, displaying a single urgent message. Destination reached. Locate the heart of the melody. Ella looked around, her violin trembling in her grasp. The heart of the melody? What does that even mean? Her question was answered by a faint sound in the distance. It wasn't just a melody, it was a duet, her music entwined with another. Her heart skipped a beat as she recognized the other voice. It was Leo's violin, weaving through the air like a lifeline. "Leo," she whispered, her chest tightening. She ran toward the sound, her surroundings shifting with every step. The ground beneath her feet morphed from cobblestones to grass to crystalline pathways. The closer she got, the louder the music grew, until it surrounded her completely, pulling her forward like a current. She burst into a clearing, her breath catching at the sight before her. Leo stood at the center of the space, his back to her, playing his violin with a fervor that bordered on desperation. Around him, the air shimmered with golden threads of light, each one vibrating in time with his music. "Leo," she called, her voice breaking. He froze, the bow halting mid-stroke. Slowly he turned to face her, and for a moment, Ella's heart soared. He was alive, his eyes wide with disbelief as he took in the sight of her. "Ella?" His voice cracked, filled with equal parts relief and fear. How did you find me?" "I followed the music," she said, stepping closer. "I had to." But as she reached out to him, the golden threads around him tightened, crackling with energy. Leo winced, dropping his violin as the threads wrapped around his wrists and ankles, binding him in place. "Ella, you shouldn't be here," he shouted, panic rising in his voice. "It's not safe." "I'm not leaving without you," she yelled back. clutching her violin. The air around them grew heavy, and a low, mechanical hum filled the space. Ella turned to see the timekeepers emerging from the rift, their forms flickering like shadows made of metal. The largest of them stepped forward, its voice cold and emotionless. "The anomaly must be contained. Surrender the conductor." "Conductor?" Ella whispered, looking at Leo. "They mean me," he said, his voice bitter. "The music, I used it to open the rift, but it's too powerful. It's tied to me now, and they won't stop until they've erased it." Ella's mind raced. The timekeepers advanced, their glowing eyes fixed on Leo. She could feel the weight of the device in her hand, its warmth pulsing like a heartbeat. The melody. It wasn't just a key, it was a bridge, a way to connect and create. "Leo," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "Play with me." "What?" "Trust me." She raised her violin, her bow trembling as it hovered over the strings. Leo hesitated for only a moment before nodding, lifting his own instrument. Together, they began to play. The music that filled the air was unlike anything Ella had ever heard. It was raw and wild, a blend of chaos and harmony that resonated through the space. The golden threads around Leo shimmered, loosening their grip, while the timekeepers faltered, their forms flickering as if destabilized by the sound. Ella poured everything into the melody. Her fear, her hope, her love for Leo. The device in her hand began to glow brighter, its energy feeding into the music. The threads of light responded, weaving themselves into a cocoon around her and Leo, shielding them from the encroaching timekeepers. The largest timekeeper raised its arm, its voice cutting through the music like a blade. "Cease the sequence. The rift cannot hold." But Ella didn't stop. She played harder, faster, the notes soaring higher until the threads of light exploded outward, engulfing the entire space. The timekeepers froze, their forms dissolving into particles of light as the music reached its crescendo. The rift shuddered, the edges of the world beginning to blur and fade. "Ella!" Leo shouted, his voice breaking through the chaos. She turned to him, tears streaming down her face. The golden threads around him were unraveling, but so was the world around them. The rift was collapsing. "We have to finish the song," she said, her voice trembling. "It's the only way to close it." Leo nodded, and together they played the final notes. The music swelled, filling every corner of the collapsing rift with its power. The golden threads wove around them, forming a barrier that shielded them from the implosion. And then there was silence. When Ella opened her eyes, she was lying on soft grass, the sky above her a brilliant shade of blue. She sat up, her heart racing as she looked around. "Leo?" she called, panic rising in her chest. "I'm here." She turned to see him sitting a few feet away, his violin resting on his lap. He looked exhausted but alive, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "We made it," he said. Ella let out a shaky laugh, tears streaming down her face. She crawled over to him and threw her arms around him, holding him tightly. "I thought I lost you," she whispered. "You found me," he said softly, resting his forehead against hers. "You always do." As they sat there, the melody of their song lingered in the air, a testament to their bond, a love that had defied time, space, and even the rift itself. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Ella felt at peace.